fishing in such a stirring way. Don't imagine, ladies and gentlemen, that there are dozens of other meetings across Sussex today like this one. It's up to you. If you're not out there leafleting and talking to people and convincing people, nobody else is going to be doing it. It is very easy in this proud old seaside town to make a case for Brexit that is founded in patriotism and in contentment with the past. Here we are looking out over the grey waters of the Channel, what our national poet observes serves us in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. Here in Eastbourne we have the old remains of the Napoleonic-era fortress built when there was a previous attempt to bring Europe under the sway of a single regime. It was here that evacuees went through a double evacuation. Children came here from London during the Blitz, and then after the fall of France, when it was assumed that the German invasion would hit on this part of the coast, they were removed a second time. And so it's so easy, because of our geography and our venue, I could so easily stand here and make a speech in the spirit of that famous cartoon that appeared just after the fall of France of the British soldier shaking his fist into the murk on top of the White Cliffs with the caption, "Very well alone." I could stir you to rage by haranguing you for an hour about the atrocities and expenses and other abominations that we see in my place of work. And you'd all nod along. Some of you heard me do it, I can see. But all of you would nod along vigorously, and then at the end, none of you feel any better. My friends, if we're going to win this, we have to do it by offering something better. We have to have a vision of Britain as a global country which is optimistic, which is internationalist, which is modern. And that's the vision I want to sketch out for you now. The truth is that the European Union is a hangover from an earlier age. It's an unwanted 1950s construct, whose structures recall an era when freight costs were high, when refrigeration was expensive, when global trade was relatively limited, and when it looked as though the future was with regional blocs. Technology has eliminated that world. Geographical proximity has never mattered less than it does in the internet age. It is as easy for a company here to do business with a firm in New Zealand as to do business with a firm immediately across the Channel. In fact, easier, because the Kiwi company, unlike the French one, will be English-speaking, common law. It will have the same accountancy methods. It will have the same arbitration procedures, the same unwritten business ethics. I'm not sure it ever made sense for us to abandon a global set of trade agreements and replace them with a regional set. I mean, if you think about it, the whole essence of a market, the whole purpose of trade, is that it allows you to swap on the back of differences. It allows you to purchase from elsewhere commodities or services that you could not produce yourself except at prohibitive cost. Right? So how did it ever really make sense to move from a genuinely diverse market, a market which included commodity-based economies, agrarian economies, industrial, service-based, financial, and replace it with one customs union of a series of similar developed economies at the western tip of the Eurasian landmass? Well, I could see how at least the argument might have been made in the 50s, the 60s, even the 70s, because those were the years of the German and Western European Wirtschaftswunder. They were the years when Western Europe was growing handsomely and outperforming most of the rest of the world. A lot of people in Britain looked across the Channel and said, "Oh, they're doing something right. Maybe we should hitch our wagon to that locomotive." Our timing, we can now see in retrospect, could not have been worse. Western Europe did indeed grow spectacularly between 1945 and 1973, the year that we joined. joined in 1973, the oil shock hit in 1974, Western Europe never really properly got going again. In the meantime, there was an unprecedented boom in the English-speaking and common law markets from which we had just stood aside and which continues to this day. In 2013, the size of the Commonwealth economy became larger than that of the Eurozone economy. These are economies where we have a natural advantage, linked as we are by language and law, by habit and history, and by kinship and migration. And yet, we've chosen to tie ourselves to this one part of the world. Even now, more than 40 years after we joined, I'm not sure that it's fully appreciated that on the day we joined, on the 1st of January 1973, we gave the European Commission 100% control over our trade policy. Britain does not vote or speak in the World Trade Organization. We are represented at the WTO by 1/28th of a European commissioner, who happens at the moment to be a Swedish former sociology professor. Now, as a result, we are not able to sign free trade accords with the countries where we do have natural links, and the countries which tend to be the fastest growing. Of our top 10 non-EU export destinations, Brussels has trade agreements in place with only 2, Switzerland and South Korea. There are no free trade arrangements in place between the European Union and Australia, or New Zealand, or Pakistan, or India, or Bangladesh, or the majority of Commonwealth countries in Africa, the Caribbean, or the Pacific. That's the price we paid. And the price grows every day as the world moves on. You know, we still, I think, at the back of our minds, imagine the world like one of those Mercator maps that we used to have on the wall of the geography classroom at school, you know? Europe bang in the middle. Of course, Europe isn't really bang in the middle. In order to get Europe to be in the middle on a 2-dimensional map, you have to shift the equator to give it an artificial centrality. But it's certainly not in the middle economically or politically. Just as the 18th century saw a shift in the center of gravity in the world from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, so our generation is seeing a shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, Britain is a maritime country, a country with connections in every quarter of the world, with every continent and every archipelago, but we cannot exploit those advantages as long as we remain stuck in the world's only dwindling customs union. Every other part of the world extraordinarily has recovered, more than recovered, has flourished. But the Eurozone's economy, this is an almost unbelievable fact, is the same size that it was in 2008. Every continent in the world is growing except Antarctica and Europe. This is no place for a country like ours to find itself. The year we joined the European Union, or the countries now in the European Union, accounted among them for 36% of world GDP. Today, that figure is 17%. This is not a trade bloc we would be applying to join today. Knowing what we now know, would anyone, can you imagine any Labour or Conservative politician saying, if we were not in the European Union now, saying, this is where the future is. This is where we need to be. What's holding us in? Well, it's what the great economist Milton Friedman called the tyranny of the status quo. Oh, what a great phrase that is. Tyranny of the status quo. Not just the risk aversion, not just the bias against change to which all human beings are prone in their DNA. The tyranny of the status quo also refers to the way in which vested interests grow up around whatever happens to be the established dispensation. Think of how many people have learned how to make a good living out of the European Union, as consultants, as contractors, maybe as some of the mega landowners getting money out of the CAP, or many of the NGOs, many of the charities that are now effectively pensioners of Brussels. These are going to be the people leading the pro-EU campaign. And in the forefront will be those mega corporations, those giant multinationals who have spent years and millions lobbying the EU to get rules that suit them but hurt their competitors. Now, the biggest surprise to me when I was a newly elected MEP, single biggest shock to me, was how much private companies liked regulation. I had innocently supposed that, being private companies, they would have a bias towards freedom of action and minimum state control. Well, that was soon knocked out of me. The big corporations love regulation because it raises barriers to entry. It gives them more monopoly control. It makes it harder for a small competitor to break in. If I give you just one example of hundreds that I've come across in the years that I've been working for you. The European Union some years ago banned, or in other cases restricted or made much more expensive, a number of herbal remedies and vitamin and mineral supplements. Okay? Now, opinion is divided on the efficacy of herbal remedies. Some of you in this room will think that they're far superior to conventional medicines, and others will say that they are harmless placebos. For what it's worth, my wife is in the former category and I'm in the latter. Nonetheless, she felt very strongly about this, and therefore I thought I'd better get involved. As King Solomon tells us, it's better to have a dish of bitter herbs in a house where there is love than a stalled ox and hatred therewith. And never has the bit about the bitter herbs applied quite so literally as in this case of the herbal remedies. I got involved with trying to minimize the damage of this directive. And as I was doing so, I began to ask the question, where has this come from? I mean, whether they're good or bad, they're plainly not poisonous, right? There's such a thing as the benefit of the doubt. You have to assume that no herbalist sets out to poison her customers. It's a bad business model. You know, I mean, Jim's the expert here, but I would guess that he wouldn't be rushing to invest in a company that had that as their business plan. Where was it coming from? Well, actually, in fairness, they were quite open about this. The lobbying for this regulation came overwhelmingly from the big pharmaceutical corporations because they knew that theirs would then be the only valid version of St. John's wort or echinacea or whatever it was. And sure enough, exactly as predicted, a number of the small producers, not least in this county, went out of business. That's the difference between free trade and a regulated market. And that's why the European Union falls further and further behind. At a time when the rest of the world has learned the secret of decentralization, devolution, when there is a move away from central control and towards diversity and variety and pluralism, we on this continent are uniquely going in the opposite direction, and that's why the economy keeps shrinking. Now, the question is, do we as a country have to be a part of that process? Can't we find a better way? Not only be a part of it, by the way, but pay for the privilege of being a part of it. We are paying £350 million a week in order to belong to the world's only trade bloc that isn't growing. Think of what you could do with £350 million a week. I mean, I don't know about you. The human brain is not great at computing hundreds of millions, or mine isn't anyway. So let me try and contextualize that figure. £350 million a week, £50 million a day. You could build and equip a completely new NHS hospital every week in perpetuity. £350 million a week. You could give the entire country a 2/3 rebate on their council tax forever. Or you could find some combination between more spending and tax cuts. But whatever you did with it, surely it would be a more productive use than funding the lavish lifestyles of bureaucrats, which is where our money is going at present. Now, can't we do better? Right? Instead of just giving you examples of corruption and private jets and so on, just think of the positive things that we could do with £19 billion a year if we had that to spend on our own priorities. And it's not just that we pay a direct financial price. We arguably pay a higher democratic price. Because as long as we are in the European Union, Douglas and his colleagues in the House of Commons are not the sovereign power in Britain. EU law has precedence over UK law, is automatically upheld by our courts, even in opposition to parliamentary statutes. And the result is that instead of being governed by people that we can hire and fire, like Douglas and Maria, we are governed by people who are immune to the ballot box, are invulnerable to public opinion. Actually, not just people that we didn't vote for, not just people that nobody else voted for, people actually who very often owe their position to the European Commission to the fact that people just voted against them. Because uniquely we've contrived a system where you only get to serve after the voters have said no to you, like Chris Patton or Neil Kinnock or now Jean-Claude Juncker. It's only when you've been expressly rejected by your electorate that you are invited to come and legislate for them. Now, my friends, objecting to that system doesn't make you anti-Europe. Right? If Britain were run this way, if we were governed by 28 unelected commissioners, and if they, as a result of not having to answer to anyone else, had concocted such disasters of public policy as the euro, or the Schengen zone, or the overregulation of business, I hope you'd all be against that too, right? That wouldn't make you anti-British. It wouldn't make you Anglo-skeptics. It would make you Democrats. We can do better. We have immense strengths in this country. If only we had the economic freedom and the political freedom to tailor our policies to our own needs. Why, for example, should we not be able to import cheap Chinese solar panels, which would enormously reduce energy costs and boost the whole economy? Because there are protectionist interests in the EU that don't want to. Why should we not allow our clinical trials once again to be world leaders? We had 12% of the market before the EU directives on clinical trials came into effect a decade ago. We now have 1%. Why should we not, in Hoxton, have the Silicon Valley of software programming once we are out of the EU's rules on data protection? Rules in every case that are there in order to protect some cartel or some other existing monopolistic vested interest. We can do better. And we have to offer our countrymen something better than this. I have a friend in the European Parliament, a Polish MEP. He was supposed to have been on the flight that crashed in Smolensk, killing the President of the Republic and almost the entire leadership of Poland. He had given up his seat on that flight at the last minute to a member of his staff. He'd said, we can go by train or we can go by air. I'll tell you what, I'll take the slow route. You can go by plane and then you can have the weekend with your family. You can imagine how he was feeling when the news came through of what had happened. And we spoke long and late into the night. And he was telling me the story of his life, and he was telling me about the extraordinary impact on him as a young Pole, seeing Pope John II touring communist Poland as not only the first Pope to visit a communist country, but the first Pole to hold that office. And he told me something that I'd never heard before. He said, you know, in all of those public appearances, the Holy Father never once directly criticized the communist authorities. He said he didn't have to, because he was offering something better. And that's what we need to do between now and June. We need to offer something better. The vision of an independent, global Britain, trading with its friends and allies on the continent, but remembering also its older friendships across the oceans. A Britain that is interested and involved in the affairs of every continent, including Europe. A Britain that retains the advantages of mutual product recognition and free trade in Europe, as every European country from Iceland to Turkey does, but is not thereby constrained and prevented from signing independent commercial accords with China or India or Australia. A Britain which, freed from the most burdensome and expensive of EU rules, becomes once again a global leader in high-tech, in education, in the audiovisual sector, in the legal sector, and in all of the other industries where we retain an advantage. Let the Eurozone continue its genteel decline. We will be as Hong Kong to their China, a wealthy, globalized, offshore, deregulated, successful enterprise zone. That surely is a future in keeping with our temper as a people and in keeping with our history and our geography. My friends, we are the 5th largest economy in the world. We're due to overtake Germany in 2030. Now that's got to be something to celebrate, if nothing else. We are the 4th military power on the planet. We're one of 5 permanent seat holders on the UN Security Council. Our language is the most widely spoken by the human race. We have the best universities in Europe. We have the best known brands internationally. We export tea to China. We export naan bread to India. We export kayaks to the Inuit. How much more successful do we have to be before we have the self-confidence to live under our own laws and our own people in our own sovereign parliament? There is a terrific, attractive, beautiful future out there, if only we have the courage to grasp it. If only we have the vision to raise our eyes to more global horizons and rediscover that global vocation.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.